A Small Boy's Cry is a foster care memoir from Rosie Lewis. This was originally published in 2014. I read it originally in 2019 and I've reread it now. I couldn't remember anything about it, and I'm kind of pleased that I couldn't remember anything because I did enjoy reading it for the right reasons. It's enjoyable, of course, to see that there is care, there is support for children who really need it, but obviously there are times when it's quite frustrating to read, such as when we meet Charlie's mother, but I won't say any more about that as I don't want to spoil it. It is a short read, I'd say half an hour, give or take, and I am left with some questions, but not really that many, and I'll explain why that's the case in a moment. Rosie fosters Charlie as an emergency placement, and Charlie is a little toddler who has actually fallen out of a window in his home, and a neighbor sees him and he ends up going to the hospital. He's generally fine, he's got a bandage on his head, but he seems okay. But he has definitely been neglected at the very least. It could potentially be the case that he's been abused, but because he's staying with Rosie for such a short time, we don't really get to know too much about his home life. And that's completely understandable. Rosie's position as a carer at this point in her foster career is as an emergency carer. So she takes on the children in an emergency. She's on call in case an emergency happens. And then within a couple of days or weeks or whatever, there'll be a more long term foster placement found for the child. And she goes back on to being an emergency carer. So I completely understand why we didn't get to delve quite as deeply into his home life as I would have liked, but we still get some information, and what we get is pretty shocking. And in a way, maybe it's a blessing that we don't find out too much more, because I can only imagine that the other information would be pretty dark and disturbing. Charlie is a very likable child, which always helps. I thought he was quite sweet for the most part, and reading obviously this information about him being at least neglected wasn't very comfortable, but to see people being there for him and to see the process of what happens, at least in this local authority, when a child is found in this situation, it's so relieving to know that it's not just a case of, well, he'll go back home while we find something to do with him. The care and the help is there immediately because of foster carers like Rosie, who are willing to be on call in the middle of the night to take in a child in need when they need the support the most. And it's so comforting. I don't know if this is the case in every local authority in the UK or if it's just the practices of certain ones, but either way, it was really good to read about from this perspective, and it's very well written as well. Which is not always the case with some foster care memoirs, but certainly I find Rosie Lewis's pretty awesome. And it's an absolute pleasure to read for the right reasons. Difficult at times for, well, unfortunately for Charlie, for the wrong reasons, but it's definitely one that I recommend. If you're new to foster care memoirs, I'd say this is relatively tame and a pretty good introduction to the type of stories you might encounter, but it's not so tame that it's boring. So definitely a good entry level one as well. And because it's quite short, um, it's not too much of a commitment. As I said before, while I had some questions, mostly about his past and his home life, I wasn't left completely wanting more information because we do actually get a little bit of an epilogue, which is often not the case with the short memoirs because the foster carer only has a tiny bit of information. But this one, I feel like it was a lot more satisfying. So definitely all round a really brilliant read for the right reasons. Very well written, very interesting, a little bit difficult to read at times because of what Charlie went through, but ultimately A Small Boy's Cry is one that I'm very happy to recommend.